If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?
Just in case you wanted to know even more about shape layers in After Effects, this is the bonus lecture for you, okay? So we're going to talk about a couple things, including setting up blank shape layers and how to kind of fill the parts in for those groups, okay? Which can be slightly confusing. And then I want to talk about a couple other things with shape layers that I think are really fantastic. In particular, I want to talk about a function called the repeater, which I'm going to show two different examples of how that can be really useful in After Effects, okay? And then I also want to talk a little bit more about the handshake between After Effects and Illustrator when it comes to vector art and how there are ways to kind of open vector art and manipulate them in pretty special ways inside of After Effects that we haven't covered yet, all right? So this is a pretty good bonus lecture, and I think we will learn a lot. Okay, let's set up a sample comp and we'll work in there, all right? So I'm going to make a new comp, and I'll make it 1920 by 1080, okay? And I will make a solid and give it a color, and I will drop it in the background. Okay, so far so good. Now let's talk for a second about blank shape layers, because there is actually, if you go up to Layer and New, you can see that you can, there's no keyboard shortcut for it, unfortunately, I think because they ran out of Option, Command, Shift, and Y functions. But anyway, if you go up here to Layer, New, and Shape Layer, you can make a blank shape layer. So here it is. There's nothing on screen now. It does have an anchor point, but if I twirl down here, you'll see that the contents, there's no way to twirl down any further into there. Okay, so that really is, it's like a shape layer with nothing on it. All right. Now After Effects does let you build shape layers this way for some reason, which I'm going to admit I've never really done this, and I'm not really sure why you'd want to, but After Effects definitely gives you the option, and I'm sure there are some people, possibly people who are even watching this lecture, who are like, oh, that's the way that I always make shape layers. I don't know. After Effects users are very specific, and they have, really specific needs sometimes that, I don't always get. So for some reason, you could do this, okay? Make a new blank shape layer, and then add a group. And that group is also empty, but that is essentially like the folder structure that you can start putting things in. Again, not totally sure why this is this way, but I know it is. So now, for example, I could add a rectangle. Okay, and now it's in that group, right? And what's weird is it's still blank. So we've added we've done three steps and we still have a blank layer, okay, but at least now it knows it kind of wants to fill into the shape of a rectangle somehow. And now what we could do is add a fill, okay, which is going to default to being this red color. But here you go. Now we're essentially building up what it would look like if you just made a square with the shape tool in the first place, right? So now we could add like a stroke, right? And there you go. Now we've got like a stroked filled rectangle, and instead of it being in a folder called rectangle, it's in a folder called group 1. And we could make other groups on this shape and fill them in with on this shape layer rather, and fill them in with other shapes, just like you could add multiple shape layers to one layer. Okay? And now, of course, you could change all of these values, and you have all these options just like you did before. So you could make this long and wide, and you could, you could take off the stroke, and you could change the color. Anything that you'd normally be able to do with a shape layer, you can now do here, including animate it, and also including, by the way, converting this to the Bezier path, like that. So you no longer have that, but you have path options. Okay, I know I went over all that, so you don't need to hear that again, but there you go. That's how you build up blank shape layers from nothing. And yeah, it's all these here. And I kind of mentioned that and not to worry about those. I really don't think you need to think about that much, but I just wanted to show you that you can do that, okay? So now what I really do want to talk about, which I think is really useful, is this function here, the repeater, okay? Other than trim paths and merge paths, which we talked about both during the regular lecture, I think the repeater is what I use most in this menu. I don't really use the distortion ones too much. Occasionally maybe I'll wiggle a path, okay, if I want it to look kind of like hand jittery animation or something, all right? But let's talk about this repeater, and I want to show you two different functions for the repeater. I'm going to delete that. And okay, so the first function of the repeater is if you wanted to make a full screen of little dots, just say like a halftone pattern or something, you could do that in After Effects using the repeater. And so let me walk you through that now. So I'm going to turn my stroke off, and I'm going to make just like a little white circle, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the title action safety here, or the quote button, right? And I'm going to get into the very center, and I'm going to make this in the center, okay, my circle. I'm going to make this actually really small, like that big, okay? Well, maybe that's too tiny. I'll make it 8 tiny, a little bit bigger, just in case. Let's make it 15 pixels square, okay? So we have that now, and I'm going to need to apply 2 different instances of the repeater. So let's walk through this step by step. I'm going to take my ellipse and I'm going to select it, and I'm going to add a repeater to it, okay? And when I select it, by the way, this ellipse, it puts the repeater inside this folder structure here, which I think is useful. It doesn't have to be. Here, I'll delete that for 1 sec. And if I don't select my ellipse, just select my shape layer and I add the repeater, it puts it down here. It really doesn't matter in this case, okay? It could be in there or down there. Because we only have the one shape, it knows that we're just repeating that one shape, this one ellipse, okay? So let's walk through these repeater settings because it's a little bit tricky, I find. The default setting for the repeater is that it makes 3 copies, and as you can see here, 3. And then there's, under the repeater, there's another little menu here, transform repeater, okay? And if you twirl down that, you'll see that all these are set to basically 0 or 100%, except for this position here. This is set at the default value, for whatever reason, of 100 pixels. So when you turn on the repeater, always, it's going to look like kind of like this with whatever your shape is. It's repeating your shape, whatever you made there, 3 times, okay, and separating each one out 100 pixels from the other one. All right, so great. So let's just keep it at 100 pixels for now. I just wanted to point that out. And what you have to do here is, this is kind of funny, because I made my shape in the center, when I make more copies of this, just say I make like 20 copies of this, it builds them all that way, okay? This way on screen, starting with the first one and moving it there. So if I want this one to be in the center and all of them to be kind of around it, what do I need to do is change this offset. And basically I want to make this a negative value that's half of the number of copies, because that will then put the center one back in the center. So if I have 20 copies and I change the offset to -10, now the center one's in the center and these are spread out like that, okay? So this number, I find, to get it evenly centered, should always be exactly half of that number. So if you made 30 copies, you'd want the offset to be -15, okay? All right. I think that's the kind of math we can all do. So great. So I think there you go. That's one set of repeaters. Now, I'm going to call this I'm just going to select that and hit return, just like you can with any layer in After Effects. And I'm going to call this my horizontal repeater. Okay? And now I'm going to select my shape layer, and I'm going to add another repeater on there. Believe it or not, a second repeater. And now this repeater will repeat the ellipse and the first repeater, okay, as you will see. And you never need to hear the word repeater, I don't think, any more times after this lecture. All right, so right now, I'm in my second repeater, okay, and it's also defaulted to 3 copies, and as you see here, 100 pixels. So in this case, it's doing the exact same thing as the first repeater, so we can't even see it. All right, but what I want to do in this case is not have them be spread out 100 pixels on the X distance, but on the Y distance, right? So I'm going to select this and click there and make that 0. And then I'm going to take the Y value of position. Remember, this is always listed in X and Y unless it's in 3D, and then it's X, Y, and Z. But the X is always first, and then the Y is second, right? So I could change this to 100, all right? And now you can see that it has 3 copies, and it's moving it down 100 in each case, right? So I kind of need to do the same thing that I did with the first one. And let's just say that I make this 20, and I make this -10. Okay, so now you see that it's like all kind of spaced out right there for me, and that's not too hard. Now I've just created, like, you know, basically a field of dots here, and we could like still animate this and stuff. Now I will say with the repeater, one of the frustrating things for me is that you can't add, or maybe you can, but I have not yet figured out a simple way to add like variability into these repeaters. Basically, you have one shape here and you're repeating it all these times, and if you change this shape, like if I make this red or whatever, not that I'd want to, all of them become red at the same time, right? So what would be cool here is if you could make like something that has like a randomized blinking or something, but I've not yet figured that out, although I'm sure some After Effects geniuses do know how to do that. But in any case, we could make a cool rotation with this just as a still object, right? For example, if I could scale this up to the point where only this one circle is on screen, right? And I could then make a little animation where I set the scale and go like, I don't know, 20 frames and then go back down to 100%. And, you know, it would look like this, which is kind of crazy and fast. So we could probably spread that out a little bit more, etc. But you get the idea. You could put like cool animations in here. And you could always add ease to that and whatever you want, all right? Okay, so that's great, but what if you wanted to change the size of the circle or change the spacing here or whatever? How would I do this? Okay, so let me just walk you through this too. So the first thing is you could definitely, you know, any change you make to the ellipse will update automatically to all the shapes, right? So if I make this like 5 pixels, like a tiny little dot here, the other ones will update, right? And so in order to change the spacing now, all I would have to do is get into my 2 different repeaters, like my horizontal repeater. Right now, the position distance of the repeat is 100 pixels, right? But let's just dial this down to like 50, just say, and make them closer together. And we'll do that for both sides, right? So what I would have to do now is, because I halved this number, I think roughly I'd have to kind of like double this number, something like that, 40. And then remember, we have to have this be negative and half, so I'd set this to negative 20 here for the offset, so it's kind of in the middle again. And now that's good for my horizontal repeater. Oh, and I got to name my vertical repeater, so let me call it vert repeat. Okay. And now all I have to do is, okay, so the position on the Y here, the up down, I need to change to 50, right? So now that's together. And it just looks like I need to set my number of copies and offset down to like, I don't know, 36 and maybe like negative 18. Right? And there you go. Now I've made the ellipse smaller and the, you know, spacing a little bit closer together, right? So repeater is really useful for this kind of thing, and I use it to create little dot fields all the time myself. So try that out for yourself, and I want to talk about one other really cool function for the repeater too that I also use a lot, okay? So I'll make a new comp here, and whatever, and I'll make a new solid, and I'll make this one even darker, dark blue, okay? So far, so good. So what I want to do now is talk about making a little burst, like a little fireworks display, or fireworks burst. I'm not going to make a whole display, just one probably, and how we would kind of animate that using repeater. Okay, so this is something that you see a lot in motion graphics, and sometimes students ask me, how do they do that? So this is something I often show to students, right? So what I'm going to do first, and this is important, is put on my title action safe so I can see the exact middle of the screen, right? And then I'm going to take my pen tool, and I'm going to, let's see, I want to make this no fill here, so I can click that. And then let me give this like, I don't know, 4-point stroke, and yellow is fine. Okay, I'm going to get in here now, and I'm going to make my first point right in the center. And I think this is actually kind of important. And then I'm going to go up, though you could also go sideways, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to make another point here, and I'm holding down on Shift, so now I know this is a straight line, okay? Good enough. Now let me pull back, and what I could do is turn that off and go into my shape layer here, which I'm going to call my burst. And first things first, I'm going to find my shape and go down to the stroke, and I want to make this a round cap, okay? Just so I could have nice round edges there. And maybe I'll make this 5 instead of 4, so it's a little easier to see. Cool. So far so good. And now what we need to do is add okay, there's 2 steps that we need to take here, and I think for the sake of this talk, I'm going to add the repeater first, and then I'm going to animate it all together. You could also just animate this shape and then add a repeater on. It's really basically the same, but I kind of want to show you this. So if I go up to my layer and select it and add a repeater. Okay, so now you see that it's done the same thing that I said it's always going to do, which is make 3 copies and push them 100 pixels apart, which in this case we don't want at all. We don't want any position shift on these repeaters at all. So I'm going to dial this down to 0, right? So now there's 3 copies stacked in the middle. And now this, okay, now we have to talk a little bit more about math, but I think it's pretty simple, okay? I think, because I can do it, so I'm pretty sure if I can do it, you guys can too. But what we need to do is figure out the number of copies we want of this rotating around itself and the angle that all of those copies would be at, okay? So what I'm going to do is I move the position back to 0, but now what we need to adjust is the rotation, which by default is set to 0 whole degrees and 0 rotation. So as I rotate this, you can see that like there's my 3 copies and they're, you know, rotating, all right? So what I've found from this after much trial and error is that the number of copies, in this case 3, times the rotation value, not the whole rotation, but the degree rotation value, has to equal 360 to make this work, all right? So if we want 3 copies, we have to ask ourselves, 360 divided by 3 is what? And the answer to that is actually close to this. It's 120, right? So if you do that, they're evenly spaced out, and now you've made a Mercedes-Benz symbol, I guess, right? But if we want more of a burst thing, just say we want 8 points, okay? 8, right? And what we would need to do is figure out what 360 divided by 8 is, which is 45 degrees, all right? So now that fits like that, all right? If we had 6 points here, okay, we would need to set this to, that's right, math fans out there, 60, all right? So I'm going to undo that, and I like the one with 8 and 45, okay? Great. So we've set like the shape. So far so good, and if you ever need like an asterisk shape or whatever, you can just do that, and that's great. But now, to make this a little burst, this is kind of fun. What we need to do is add in now one of our favorite new tools, which is a trim path. Okay, so let's go select our burst and add a trim path to this. Okay, and it puts it above the repeater, which I think you need to put it below. Okay, and so actually I'm not sure. No, I think we put it above the repeater. I think that was good where it started. Okay, so I'm going to go down a couple frames, like 2 or 3 frames or whatever, and I'm going to take the end and I'm going to make this down to 0. Okay, I'm just going to dial that down. And I'm going to make a keyframe there. And I'm going to do an animation where I move like maybe 20 frames. We'll try this out for now. And I set this to 100. Okay? And this comp is a little bit long, and I don't need it to be that long, so I'm just going to set the work area there, and I'm going to right-click in here and trim comp to work area, just so it's a little easier to see, right? So right now we've built an animation like this, which is kind of half of the burst, right? But now what we need to do is also animate the start, okay? And as you see, this animation is causing the line to move up this way, but we need the line to also start unmaking itself on, and that's why we want the start. And we want that to start happening quickly after the initial keyframe, I think. So I'm going to set a 0% start keyframe here, and then I'm going to go a couple keyframes after, maybe right on the same frame as the final end keyframe. And I'm going to dial this now up to 100, okay? And maybe I want a couple frames there. So let's just see what that looks like just with nothing, right? So you can kind of see this right away. It's like this little burst, and that happens, and it's pretty cool. And depending on, you know, when you start this animation for the start coming off, that depends on how long these lines will be, right? And the more you move this closer together so that the start and the end happen at the same time, the more that it'll all disappear down into like some little tiny end points at the end of the burst, right? Like that. And I think that's kind of like basically what we want. It's like a little right? But just to take this like one step farther, all right, let's take these, and now that we've talked about the graph editor a little bit, I'm going to press F9, right? And let me show you how you can adjust these in the graph editor to make this burst a little bit better. So I'm going to go into the graph editor by pressing this button. Hopefully we all remember that now. And basically, if you think about a burst, it's like, boom, a lot of energy right at the start, and then it kind of fades out over a long time. Fireworks are like, boom, fade, 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 right? So in order to kind of reflect that here, what I would do is take these first 2 keyframes, the first start and end keyframe there, and I'm going to hold down shift and I'm going to shove these up toward the beginning so that they're happening a lot faster. Okay, right away that's kind of happening. And similarly, I'm going to take the end points and I'm going to kind of drag these back, holding shift, so that the end happens a lot slower. And let's check this out. You can see it's more of like a burst now. And I think right now these keyframes could probably come back a little bit like that, right? So you can see that's like totally fun. And now like all we would have to do, for example, is duplicate this, right? And maybe change the timings of this a little, 1 frame, and then you could make this like, I don't know, pink, and take it and move it like over here, right? And then you can have like a little fireworks display, and it can look really awesome. And you could even change the thickness of some of these strokes or whatever. You could get in there and change this. You could change the size. You know, so you could do quite a lot of interesting things to make like a little burst. action happen here. Okay, cool. So I think that's really a fun little way to use the repeater too. Okay, now let's just talk about two other things about the way that Illustrator and After Effects work together in a little bit more detail. Okay, so in Illustrator, I'm going to make a complex shape using the shape tool, and I'm going to make it with a bunch of different shapes here. So I'm going to make like a shape like this with like, just say some weird like multiple rectangles, and for the heck of it, I'm even just going to, I'll throw like an ellipse in there, okay? So just say this, for whatever reason, this is the shape that I really need to have in my After Effects project, all right? So I can actually get this into After Effects two different ways, both of which are different and have different implications for the animation, so I need to walk you through both of these, okay? So the first one is, I can just copy this, Command-C in Illustrator, and then go to After Effects, and now I can just, in a new comp here or whatever, I can make a new solid, which you have to do in order for this to work. Okay, so I make a new solid, I'll make this a bright blue, and then what I can do is paste, Command-V, and if I paste that, you'll see those shapes now. Let me turn this off. Those are the shapes that we created in Illustrator, and because I pasted them onto a solid, okay, it made them into masks, and for whatever reason, it defaults to making them difference masks, which probably not something that you're too familiar with, and I think probably what you'd want in this case is just add, so that you could have it be like this one big shape, okay? But what's cool about this copy-paste method is that now just on this one solid layer, I essentially have, almost like a shape layer, I have these masks which make these shapes, so I can just kind of animate these separately, right? Like I could, you know, take my green, which is this now, and I could, you know, I have control over these points. So I can change these, or you know, I could take just my circle, which is this here, and I could select that and make like an animation. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not the circle. It's the square, right? So I can make an animation just for this square or whatever. And because it's a solid and it was a full screen solid, you know, wherever this is on screen, it'll always be filled in with that blue color, right? So that's kind of cool. And even if you wanted, you could break this down into individual shapes in After Effects by like duplicating this 4 times and deleting out, you know, all the masks except one in each time. Then you could have one mask per each layer, and then, you know, you could animate those individually that way. Okay, so that's one way to go, is copying and pasting directly from Illustrator is a great way to go. Now I think a slightly better way to go is more like if we oh, and I should say, before I get into that next method, so these are all separate shapes, right? And that's why when I pasted it came in as different masks. If you know, find your Pathfinder, for example, and select all these shapes, and I press this button, and it kind of merges it all into one big shape now, even in Illustrator. Now, obviously, if I copy that and I go back to After Effects, I can, you know, let me undo this and make a new solid, and I'll make this a different color just for the heck of it. And now paste this here. Now you see it's pasted in as one mask, okay? Which, I don't know, might be more useful or might be less useful, depending on what you want. I just wanted to point that out, okay? Another thing that's cool about Illustrator is I'm actually going to undo that, so I now have these separate kind of more shapes again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as an AI file, and then I'm going to open this in After Effects by, you know, importing this as a more regular Illustrator file, the way we would normally import art. Okay, so I'm going to do that, save that. So here's my shape layer that I just imported into After Effects, just in the normal way, just as footage, right? And I will take my shape layer and move it into the comp by pressing Command and the slash that's under question mark, right? So here's that shape that I just made in Illustrator, and I imported it just the normal way. Okay, so it is an Illustrator layer, right? This is not a copy-paste situation. So what can I do with this now? Well, you know, just all the normal things, you know, that you would normally be able to do in your normal transform options. But there is a better way to go here. If you want more individual control over these, right, what you could do is right-click or option-click on the, you know, this case, my Illustrator layer, and then I can go down to Create Shapes from Vector Layer, right? And when I select this, now it made this, it turns off shape, okay, and it gave me this new layer called Shape Outlines. And now if we dig down into this, into the contents, and now you see this actually has a contents menu, unlike when we just copy and paste it onto a mask. And so now here are some groups, kind of like we went over before, because it doesn't really know like what these shapes are, so it just calls it like a group folder. But it does give you the path option that you would ordinarily have to convert for. So this is actually really useful too. And now this is actually even more useful in a way, I think, because it's converted these to shape layers. So now I can just select one of them, for example, and change like the color of it, right? And it won't be influencing the other ones, which is pretty sweet. And similarly, we have all this transform properties for each individual one, so I can do like an animation just for this circle, and that's super cool, right? So that's a really great thing to be able to do, is convert Illustrator layers into shape layers within After Effects, because it gives you all the advantages that you'd have of shape layers in After Effects, and it just makes it a lot more editable, basically. So that's awesome. You wouldn't have to apply like an effect on this to change the color or whatever, and it's just I think it's kind of easier. I was gonna say way easier, but I still do this only like about 50% of the time. If I really need to make some adjustments to the layers, to the shape layers, then I'd probably convert them. But if I know they're going to stay about the same, then you might not have much of a need to convert them if the artwork in Illustrator is just the way you want. Okay? So one other thing that I think I should mention about copying and pasting from Illustrator, I did forget to mention. So let's jump back for 1 sec. Okay, cool. So the other thing is, I'm going to delete this, is you can make a path in Illustrator. Okay, and this is kind of similar to what we talked about last week, just making a path in After Effects. But I just wanted to point out, if you're more comfortable with the Illustrator tools, then you can do this kind of thing in Illustrator as well. So if I now select this path and copy and paste that, right, and I go back to After Effects, now I believe that what I can do is like delete these, okay, and make a new just like circle, right? And I'll put that in the center, and I'll Option Command Home to put this anchor point in the center, and Command Home to make sure it's in the center. Okay, and now I can do that same thing that we did last time. I can select my position and not click on the stopwatch, but on the word position here, right? And then I can make sure to go back to the beginning now, paste, right? And now I can paste that path from Illustrator, the doofy one that I just made for whatever reason, and it pastes it in there, and it makes it the internal ones into Rove keyframes, just like we did before. And what's cool about this too is that you can actually still adjust all these points. So that's actually a really useful thing to be able to do too. And yeah, that pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about today in this intermediate shape layers lesson. And I hope that explained a couple extra things for you about shape layers and gave you a couple of different animation ideas for things that your devious mind might be able to apply to some of these homeworks. Right on. So good luck with this, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?